In Unit 1, we learned that American history can date back at least 12,000 years when the Americas were settled by people crossing from Asia through what we know now as Alaska, moving right along to the War of Independence from 1775 to 1783 to obtain freedom from British rule. In the 1800s, there's a population of about 5 million people. More than 90% of people are farmers. The industrial production is rare and very few factories. During this time, some of the inventions were the mill to turn grain into flour powered by a water wheel. So farming was the backbone of this new nation. Next, we will talk about the French and British influences when it comes to engineering. In France, there is a big central state and military origin to engineering, and the main employer of French engineers had a very mathematical and theoretical approach, i.e., why things work. The French engineers were of a higher social class, creating engineers to be a prestigious class. The British engineers' approach was on-the-job training in the private sector. Similar to a union having apprentices working up through journeyman levels, the goal of British engineering was how it works. It came from a working class and wasn't as prestigious, and the British engineers were money-oriented and worked for a company. Next, I will talk about the Erie Canal and it being probably the greatest engineering accomplishment of the 19th century. The Erie Canal could be considered one of the first American schools or types of training for engineers. The need for the canal comes from a trade standpoint. One of the biggest obstacles was the Appalachian Mountains. The initial thought of the Erie Canal was well thought out due to its location in New York and no drastic changes in elevation. The engineers started from the middle of where the canal would run through due to its lack of elevation. The overall goals of the canal were to move people and products from the eastern states west and to deliver grain from the west to markets in New York City. The canal was thought to be an extremely cheaper method of moving crops than by wagon at the time. The project was said by Thomas Jefferson to be a little short of madness and was widely called Clinton's Ditch in reference to DeWitt Clinton and the cost and ambition of the project. The project was considered a success due to the help of William Weston from Britain. John Jervis is one engineer who rose through the ranks all the way up to superintendent.
Engineers' role in society was non-existent in America in the early 1800s. While it was a highly respected role in France and a less prestigious occupation in Britain, large projects in the U.S. would soon establish this role in American society. American politics shaped engineering into a highly respected career. The decision to build the Erie Canal through New York instead of letting trade flow through cities like Philadelphia, Baltimore, and Montreal allowed many workers to learn on-the-job skills to become engineers. With the industrial growth in the United States from building the canal, it created more jobs that needed engineers. The demand for engineers began to grow because of the rise of big business in the late 1800s. This put engineers in a dilemma of how to balance business and personal interests. This was solved by creating professional societies. Professional societies allowed engineers to have a specialized branch of knowledge, create criteria for membership, and have an ethical code. Education in engineering in the U.S. moved from on-the-job learning to higher education. Theory-based learning was first introduced in the U.S. by West Point with their 4-year curriculum in 1817. By 1860, most engineers had some form of academic training.
In 1862, the Morrill Land Grant Act was passed, which provided people to attend with low cost and tuition, and sometimes no cost. This led to over 100 programs for training engineers by the 1900s. There was also a huge growth of students in a 10-year period from 1890 to 1900. Students increased from as little as 1,000 to 10,000. And by 1931, 70% of engineers trained at land and grant colleges. When we look at social status in the 19th century, not all jobs offered an equal status, and pay was only one of those deciding factors. Engineering didn't really have a high social status like they do today. There was lack of knowledge and tradition. Autonomy was limited by corporate employment, and the ranks were primarily middle and lower class. People were more into being lawyers or doctors, which had higher social class, making engineering closer to the British tradition rather than the French. In the 19th century, it wasn't exactly ideal for women and minorities. Women were seen as too weak to fit the mold, and they had almost no access to any sort of programs or educational opportunities. For African Americans, slaves often had technical skills, but they couldn't because of the lack of independence. Freed blacks faced extreme discrimination, and education was non-existent to them. Some of these people did overcome these challenges. For example, Emily Roebling, who took over the building of the Brooklyn Bridge when her husband became very ill, and Benjamin Banneker, who was self-taught in astronomy and became a surveyor to help plot Washington, D.C., only to later publish a series of almanacs and corresponding with Thomas Jefferson.
Hello, I'm going to be going over Module 3, which is, of course, inventions. So why do people invent? Following the British method of engineering in the 19th century was mostly workers in specific industries coming up with solutions to make their jobs easier. The linear model expresses that it takes investment to do research and development, which leads to an invention that creates social changes. The hard part of this is for women and African Americans. Even if they invented it, often their husband or owner would get claim for their invention. There are two types of inventions: radical and conservative. Radical inventions are game changers that can change how we do everything. The jet engine changed how long it took us to go around the world. Conservative inventions are inventions that modify an existing product. An example of adding a spoiler to a car to gain a few horsepower by avoiding resistance. The most talked about inventors are independent inventors. Most come from rural backgrounds with little or no formal education. Nikola Tesla is a good exception to that rule. There are two types of independent inventors: professional inventors, whose job is to invent all the time, which means fundraising as well; the part-time inventor, who invents but has a full-time job to fund their inventions. Often part-time inventors, like the Wright brothers, only had one project that they were working on. Perhaps the best example of an independent inventor is Thomas Edison. He started working on railroads before realizing he had a knack for telegraphs. He made a number of patents with them before quitting the railroad and going to be a full-time inventor. The light bulb might be the best example of the myth of a single inventor. Thomas Edison had a crew called muckers that filled in the gaps that Edison did not have. He had a guy that made him perfect hand-blown bulbs. He made a light, but he needed to power a house to run the light. He and his team had to come up with a system to monitor and direct power to other houses. He had to have his team construct and maintain this system in real life. Independents did not have a steady income. Some flourished, most did not. Corporations and their labs gave the ability of a job still inventing, but generally working on conservative inventions. Technology eventually gets too complicated. Higher schooling becomes almost necessary for inventors. Bill Gates did not have a higher education, but he found a need at a time where education could not keep up with him. And here are some more examples of independent inventors recently. Who's next?